All right, so let's go ahead and get started with our lecture for today. So today what we're going to be talking about is the four driving factors of evolution. Last time we talked about the different types of evidences that scientists have used to explain how evolution has happened, but today what we're going to be really diving into is like what is the mechanism behind evolution? Um, and we'll be talking about four different things that must occur in order for evolution to happen. So I'd like to start our conversation off with the guy named Charles Darwin. Some of you guys have probably heard of him in middle school, but he essentially coined the term natural selection. We're going to get more into natural selection next class, but for today, all you need to know is that he coined the term natural selection, and that natural selection is also known as survival of the fittest. When we say survival of the fittest, we're not talking about the animal that is the strongest or the biggest or the meanest. Fitness in this case, or in the case of evolution, the word fitness means the ability to survive in their environment. So the more likely that you are to survive in your environment, the more fit you are. We're going to talk a little bit more about that, but we just want to make that distinction clear. Fit does not mean big. You could be very small and be more fit for your environment than someone or an animal that is larger than you. Um, Darwin also decided that there are also four factors that must be present in order for natural selection to happen. So today we're going to talk about these four things. The first driving factor of evolution is overproduction. There's got to be an overproduction of a species in order for that species to undergo evolution. Same thing with variation. There needs a variation of a species, competition, and finally inheritance for those species. Failure of any four of these parts to exist means that evolution is most likely not going to happen, or it's going to take actually much, much, much longer than it needs to. So we're going to start with factor number one, which is the overproduction of offspring. Um, when we talk about overproduction, we're talking about more than the environment can handle. So if we're saying there is only a certain amount of food supply, overproduction would mean that we have more species than food supply available. And that term or that concept kind of was originated through Thomas Malthus's essay on the human population and food supply. There's only a certain amount of food available, we know, on our Earth. Human population has obviously surpassed the amount of food available, and therefore, because there's an overproduction of humans, there is now a competition for food, and leaving some obviously the winners, some the losers, but that's the overall concept, right? It causes a scarcity for food, and the same thing happens in an environment. When you have an overproduction of a species, it means that there now is competition within that species because they're all fighting for the limited food sources. Um, and this overproduction ends up kind of putting pressure on the species, and some traits end up becoming more desirable than others. Some traits are going to dominate. And so, in order for this competition to even occur, there needs to be more species than food available. So, that's what we mean by overproduction. Without overproduction, like I said earlier, competition won't exist. If competition doesn't exist, there's no ways to tell which traits are what we call advantageous. So this word advantageous is pretty important when we talk about evolution. We talk about traits that are advantageous, meaning that they are better or more fit for their environment than other traits are. If there was no overpopulation, there would be no advantageous traits because everyone would survive off of the food that was available. With overproduction, so the environment can start to pick out which traits are better than others because so that then evolution can occur. If there aren't any advantageous traits, then no evolution of a species can occur. So this is an example, right, of overproduction. When a sea turtle lays eggs, it lays hundreds of eggs. And the reason it does that is because it knows that only the most fit, quote unquote, fit for the environment, only the strongest, I don't want to use the word strong because we said that strongest doesn't mean fit, but we're saying most fit for their environment, those sea turtles are the ones that are going to make it into the water and pass their genes on for future generations. So animals are starting to understand that overproduction is part of the process. This concept then leads us to the second factor. So, in order for evolution to occur, there must be variation in a species. And what variation means is that there are differences in a population. And these differences, kind of example over here of these giraffes, these differences are caused by actually random mutations. Each animal has many, many mutations, and that's what makes all of us unique from one another. Right? These are all giraffes, but because of random mutations, they've got different color spots. If everyone kind of looked the same, like these giraffes here on the left-hand side, there would be no variation and thus no evolution. When everyone kind of looks the same, it kind of goes back to this idea of there aren't any advantageous traits. When we have variation, we can start to see once these giraffes overpopulate, which is the first factor of evolution, some of these giraffes are going to have advantageous traits, meaning it helps them survive long enough to pass on their traits. Those that do not have advantageous traits will die pretty young. So we want variation. We want everything to be just a little different so that evolution can happen. If everything's the same, evolution does not happen. So we put a big X over animals that show little variation. As I kind of stated earlier, variation increases the likelihood of survival of an entire species. So think about this. If there's an entire species and they all look a little bit different, if something random would have happened to them, then some random event, so like a volcanic eruption, an earthquake, etc., the more likely it is that at least some of the species will survive because they're each a little bit different from one another. That keeps the species from going extinct. The less variation there is in a population, the more likely that this one environmental disaster, like in a volcanic eruption, drought, flooding, etc., the more likely that animals are to become extinct because they'll all react to the environmental disaster in the same way. And so that's just what the second point kind of hits. So if an environmental disaster occurred, variation would mean that at least some of the population would survive. Those who survive go on to reproduce and pass down their genes. If variation did not exist, then obviously there's a potential extinction of species because depending on how the species as a whole reacts to the environmental disasters, it could mean that they all survive, or if they all reacted badly and there was no variation, they would all die. So once enough variation within a population exists, then comes the third factor that drives evolution. And this is kind of the one that we most are aware of as the main driver of evolution, but it's competition. In order for competition to occur, you have to have factor number 2, variation, and you have to have factor number 1, overpopulation. So it all kind of ties together. So once there are enough variations in an environment, the environment will choose which traits are advantageous. There must be a clear advantage of having one trait over another. That's why we have variations, right? It's not the animal that chooses. Let's be very clear about this. Evolution happens because of the environment. The environment dictates which traits will help an animal survive and which traits won't help an animal survive. Those with advantageous traits, those with traits that do help them survive, will live long enough to reproduce and pass their genes on. Those who do not have advantageous traits die before they can reproduce. So obviously, over time, over millions of years, only the traits that are advantageous will be passed on, and thereby evolution can occur. The environment, obviously, when we talk about the environment, we're talking about our surroundings, but it could also include like predator and prey. So the environment, if there's a certain trait that an animal has that keeps it from being eaten by a predator, that would be an advantageous trait, right? The environment being the predator. The landscape, if there's a certain color maybe that an animal needs to be in order to blend into the landscape, or the certain type of fur it needs in order to meet the weather conditions of the environment. Those are also ways we describe the environment. Also like food supply, so think like giraffes, right? So the environment could include where's the food supply for this animal. So giraffes obviously need longer necks to reach its food source. Those giraffes at one point with shorter necks died off, didn't pass their genes, and thereby that's why we see longer neck giraffes. These environmental conditions determine who survives and who dies. So as the environment changes, though, this is kind of key, so do the advantageous traits. If there is a place where it's frigid, it's really freezing, animals need warm fur in order to live there, and one day a drought happens, all the snow melts, and that once cold place now becomes a desert, that means that animals with different advantageous traits are now going to survive. So sudden environmental changes can shift the favorable traits and eventually lead to the evolution of a species. What we call the gene pool changes, and an animal that was fit for the environment may no longer be fit and thus able to survive. So back to our example about the snow versus like the drought that happens, right? If an animal with really thick skin lives prosperously in this snowy environment, but then a drought occurs, then of course they might not necessarily no longer have the advantageous traits, and maybe animals within the species with thinner fur will start to survive, and over millions of years we'll start to see thinner fur of whatever that species is that lives in that environment. This is an example of competition or how the environment selects. So at one point, there are obviously at first, these tan colored mice. And what happened in the environment was that the environment, there was a volcanic eruption and it turned all of the soil black. And what you saw was one day in these mice, there was a mutation that caused the mice to have a little bit of a darker fur. And eventually, what we saw to happen was less tan mice were able to survive because they were easily seen by predators. And they didn't live long enough to reproduce. So over time, we saw less and less of the original tan mice and more of this mutated, darker skinned mice, because they found that as the environment changed to this black type rock, the darker colored mice were able to survive and hide from predators more easily. So we saw an evolution of this mice species over time due to the environment changing. This is what I mean by the environment selects the trait that is advantageous. Last but not least, this is the most important part, and the only reason why evolution happens is inheritance, and it's the last part of evolution. So those with favorable traits will live, the idea is that those with favorable traits will live long enough, right? They can survive in the environment, away from predators, away from weather, all those things. They can survive long enough to pass their genes on to the next generation. So our last example with the black mice. The darker colored mice was able to survive long enough to reproduce and produce more darker colored mice. Meanwhile, the unfavorable traits, or like the tan mice, once the landscape or the environment changed from kind of a tan color to that dark color due to the ash, they died before they could reproduce. So we started seeing less and less tan mice because those genes eventually started to disappear because those mice weren't living long enough to pass their genes on. As time goes on, only favorable traits will eventually be seen in the population. So eventually, like I said, millions of years later, we only find black mice in this environment where tan mice used to be the majority. And these 4 factors are necessary for evolution to occur. So an example here, just in a nutshell, right? This bird's like, oh my God, I love green beetles. Green beetles are great. And you can see it's because these orange beetles kind of blend in with the background. So generations later, once these birds are eating more and more of the green beetles, the orange ones or the tan ones are surviving longer. They can reproduce more orange beetles. So you're seeing a little bit more orange than green because the green aren't living long enough to reproduce. Some more time later down in this last kind of slide, you see that there are almost no green bugs because none of them have survived long enough to reproduce. Meanwhile, these tan colored ones are surviving because they're being camouflaged by the ground, and we only see now the orange/tan colored bugs survive. Meanwhile, this green color is now gone because the genes no longer exist in a population. And please remember that evolution takes millions of years to happen. And with that is my conclusion. This is the aim of natural selection, these 4 things: overpopulation, variation, competition, and inheritance. Without these 4 things, natural selection can't occur. Natural selection is a mechanism for evolution, and creation of new species is dependent on these 4 factors. And this will conclude our presentation for today. We'll move more specifically into natural selection next class.